Welcome back to this lost world of this ancient Italian palace. If you're new here, I'm Jordan Camilleri. Myself and my Italian partner recently discovered this palazzo abandoned since before I was born. A place so captivating that we decided to risk everything we have to try and bring her back to life, with not even the faintest idea of the mysteries and treasures we discover along the way. Last week, we cleared the gardens and the facades, revealing that gorgeous greenhouse and solved the mystery of a seemingly magic fountain. Today, we travel across all of northern Italy to furnish the grand designs of our new kitchen, with an idea so untested and new that it could end in disaster. Now, before we dive in, we're going to take a quick look behind the scenes to showcase briefly how we've been able to sustain ourselves these past weeks. And it's been a bit of a plug-and-play situation, at best being able to do a modest, quick fry-up to keep ourselves nice and energized. But the main reason for starting here is because it's directly connected to what will soon become the main kitchen, what used to be, in fact, formerly the dining room. And you can see with those two closed doors on the far side that they open up into fantastic storage space. Though you may wonder how it is that a dining room can be converted so easily into a kitchen. And it was all thanks to working with the local specialist of the Belle Arti Ministry, which is the Ministry of Beaux-Arts, which controls protected buildings like this one. And together we investigated this plug on the floor and realized that since it was a pre-existing connection to a technical room below, that we could use the same method for creating new systems without the need for any destructive trenches, all the while preserving and cataloguing the parquet cutouts to allow these works to be fully reversible in future if desired. And this idea really grew into becoming the main philosophy behind our intervention in this room. That unlike these artworks that were stripped from this place, as you can see from the auction numbers where these pieces once stood, that this otherwise exceptionally well-preserved room with its enormous 2 by 3 meter gesso work on the ceiling would not have its character stripped any further with interventions that could not be entirely reversible. And by forcing ourselves to think about the room in this way, we spent a long time studying this space and came up with something fairly innovative when it came to the cabinetry. The most ambitious and slightly insane idea that I've ever come up with for a kitchen, that we hide and encase all of the elements of a modern kitchen within antique movable furniture. Now, before I give you the full breakdown of what we're going to be doing into the kitchen, let me just help situate where we are a little bit. Of course, right now we're in the lounge with Peanut here living her best life, and here's a little sneak peek of some amazing marble samples that we found from 100 years ago, but more on that later. The situation with the lounge, before we go on, obviously it's relatively comfortable now, and I think that we're just going to be leaving it in this state at least for a couple months, and then we'll revisit it. And then at that point, we can truly understand what we want to do on the design side and really make things interesting here. But coming through this way, we arrive into a room that I hope you recognize as the veranda. And excitingly enough, this is going to be the space that we'll be doing our very first deep dive on next week, as heavily requested by you guys, so keep an eye out for that. But from this point forwards, we'll be switching to the first person view to understand what's going on with the kitchen, so let's get started. Part of the reasoning for moving the kitchen into this space was so it could communicate much better with the more principal areas of the palace. And this beautiful detailing of the veranda opens and gives way to this large blank canvas full of character. On the long wall, there are the 2 doors seen previously which open up into that storage, which I imagine was once used for plate and cutlery service, but it would make an ideal place to hold dried foods. Meanwhile, on the far wall is one of 2 doors opening up onto the pantry, and this was actually one of our very first jobs when moving in, which after some sweeping allowed us to entertain answering the question, can a double-breasted American-style fridge ever look in keeping in an antique Italian kitchen? But jokes aside, of course, with a bit more finessing in future, the encasing of the fridge in the existing structure was surprisingly successful. Meanwhile, the other doorway we of course intended to keep usable so that the two spaces can continue to communicate. The aesthetic change between the spaces is quite jarring, but it's a fun interplay that I hope to work with in future, especially denoted by this old feature which I'd love to refurbish. And even though there's a much more mid-century shift in feel to this space, the quality materials continue to be exceptional. Functionality-wise, we've been trying our best to scrape on by temporarily with a microwave, very un-Italian I know, just like this Nespresso station. But hey, if I just continue to tell my Italian partner it's just a few more weeks, then hopefully that will stave off the nervous breakdown. One thing I really enjoy about Italy is how the recycling culture is so alive. And so even though we have to use disposable tableware, it's all fully biodegradable with the infrastructure to back it up. But the amount of trash this makes for us is not a fun part of the situation, and this is all born from the fact that we're quite far away from the only usable sink on the entire floor, currently doppelganging also as our laundry room. Returning now to the main room, all this to say that this is the main reason why we're focusing on the kitchen as our first major project of the palace renovation. And my initial plan for this video was to use this first-person view to walk you through our layout plan with using the heavy symmetry that already exists in the room to create a homogeneous effect with the way that we'll be placing the furniture, but it just wasn't coming across very clearly. And so instead of fumbling on through, allow me to introduce today's sponsor, which actually allows me to perfectly explain what I mean. Millernote is a tool for organizing creative projects and is a super easy resource to convey to you guys and to our contractors alike what we have in store for the kitchen. Starting with the first pillar of this design, we want a layout plan which is low impact and leans into the strong use of symmetry already existing in the room. I'll drop in the floor plan created by our architect, and using the drawer feature, I'm going to highlight to you guys how we're going to use found furniture to anchor the elements of this kitchen. Antique secondhand cabinetry will be used to create an old world silhouette for both the island and the sideboards, with the middle of the island having a modern structure that hosts the more invasive utilities like the sink and dishwasher. Going back to this slightly less messy drawing I made earlier, you can already see that we started to enact this plan by partially encasing the fridge through that doorway there, as shown from entering the room via the veranda. Moving on to the second design principle, let's search through Millernote's vast stock library to visually convey how we intend to repurpose abandoned furniture and make any intervention we do entirely reversible. This brief for the furniture leans into a 19th century apothecary, or in this case, the Victorian library aesthetic. And dragging and dropping that in, this helps me to visually populate the drawings of the layout plan which I had done earlier, easily connecting the two concepts to whomever I'm sharing the board with. Now onto the final pillar, which governs how everything will be visually balanced. And here we can actually click through to a subboard that I made from one of the 100+ Millernote templates. Starting clockwise from the top, I can drag and drop in different options of swatches. Do I stick with a neutral tone to pair the wood paneling and parquet with the marble? Or do I go with a darker contrast tone? Let me know what you think down below. Now onto the accessories and accent pieces. Of course, these are not the exact items we'll be using, but by dropping them all in together through this mood board, it's such a useful way to understand that they complement each other rather than clash. But actually the best thing for me is that I can take all of this in situ with the Millernote mobile app and play around in real time with how it will really work in the space. Enjoy Millernote entirely for free with no time limit by clicking the link in the description below. Now, before we could start building the frame of the kitchen, we had to hire a van and zip all over northern Italy to find the respective pieces. The first stop was the capital of Piedmont, Turin. And we arrived nice and early in the morning so we could get our van down those sometimes narrow streets to pick up the kitchen island pieces and a few other goodies too. Nipping out of the city just in time for rush hour to hit. Then, after a drop off at the palace, we did the 6-hour round trip to Vicenza, a city I've been dying to visit since I was a kid. It could only be a brief visit, unfortunately, but we picked up some amazing sideboards to complete the antique aesthetic of the kitchen. Now, I was a bit too knackered to film the unloading of the credenza, mostly because it was such back-breaking work, but here you can see a more detailed shot of the sideboards which we picked up from Vicenza. These are destined to face opposite each other along the two long sides of the kitchen, facing the island in the middle. And one really difficult thing about finding secondhand furniture is finding those that match, both in terms of style but also two pieces. gemelli, as they're called in Italian. And so as you can also see for the island, we also found a matching pair of these astonishingly beautiful pieces in a very similar style indeed. And by studying some of the pieces, like the skirting board there, we can also replicate it for the infill section. And by working with a local carpenter to match as many of these elements as possible in the more modern filler section, we should hopefully draw all the attention to these bookended silhouettes at the end, which really should be the star of the show. Speaking of the filler section, this one is going to require a bit more playing around with to get it just right. Here you can see one transition element that I was working with to make the join less severe. And already with our contractors bringing water and electrics to the island, we were starting to feel that the proof of concept had come together and we could really make this work. Of course, our philosophy here was to be as uninvasive as possible. We did need to reduce slightly the credenza height, so we removed and catalogued the onion feet and returned them back in place. And just like that, this rather abstract idea started to take shape. And by working with that skirting element I showed you earlier, we were able to recreate it almost identically to continue the aesthetic going on to the middle section. I'm just imagining now with some shaker frontages for the cabinets, and with the right stain, this might just come off. What do you think? Feeling more and more convinced that we'd achieved a harmonious balance with the materials of the room, the other element of course was matching the marbles. And on this, we've got some rather exciting finds to share. So what we have here is a very interesting collection of marble samples that we found in one of the storage cupboards of the pantry. And these are from the original 1930s renovation, if you can believe it. Let me give you an example of what we've got here. So the very first that I'm holding here is called Calacattavaglia. Now, what's so fascinating about this is that this is not at all what modern Calacatta is known to look like. In fact, this marble right next to it, with this more grayish tone vein, is much more what you'd expect to find if you were to look up Calacatta marble today. There are different variations, but nevertheless, this does tell us a story about how marbles have changed, of course, over the last century. As these quarries have dug deeper and dug wider, the nature and the character of the veins that they're finding and producing will vary. And in fact, so much so that even one slice of marble that comes from the same quarry but produced on different days will have fairly different characteristics. And so if you are creating a space with a particular marble, it's always good practice to use the same sort of batch or the same series of slabs that were found or cut one after the other. And of course, speaking of famous marbles, Calacatta is the slightly less famous sister to Carrara, which is probably the best known Italian marble to exist today, but was pretty much always the case. Even going back to Roman times, Carrara was a favorite of the ancient Romans, and you'll find it all over the Eternal City even today. And the thing that differentiates Carrara from Calacatta is Carrara is more famous, more known for its more shadow-like, more ambiguous contrast between the lights and the darks and the grays in between. Whereas Calacatta has a pretty stark contrast between the lights and the dark veins. Moving on, we have a marble here which I recognize as being from Verona, but actually here is called Porta Santa Moderno, which means, strangely enough, saint carrier, modern saint carrier, or maybe saint bringer. But this also tells us another aspect, which was that a century ago, before standardization, before the Italian marble industry became the international phenomenon that it is today, and therefore, different hues, different characteristics, different. I suppose back in the day, each marmista or marmisti, as they're called in Italian, for marble contractors, sort of gave them their own personality and character based on what they wanted to call them, just to their own localized clients that they'd be selling to. Finally, we have the sample of the marble of the fireplace in the kitchen, or at least the sample that most closely matches it. Again, because of the variations that I was mentioning before, I can't be 100% sure that it's exactly the same marble, but it is the most similar, and it was likely just a different batch relative to the sample from what we have installed in there in the end. So there we have it. Not only is it going to help guide us in understanding and identifying particular marbles, but it does inspire me that we actually do exactly the same, and we keep a nice stored record of all of the quality materials that we choose for the renovation this time around, even if they end up being very similar or complementary versions of what we have here, because of course it shows the passage of time. These are natural materials, and perhaps those people a century from now will find it useful in much the same way that we do today, in respecting what came before and creating your own vision of what this beautiful space could be. So based on those 3 finalists which we showed you just there, I'd be curious to know what you think would work best, but personally I'm leaning towards good old-fashioned Carrara, which we have always used in our kitchen projects. But as you can see, we had cleared out these central elements because we have grand designs to finally bring some light and life back to the room. Easier said than done though, actually, with the ceiling height being nearly 6 meters. We had to build internal scaffolding just to reach the pre-existing wiring so that we could inspect it, and hopefully end both this episode and these past weeks of hustle with a satisfying conclusion. But unlike some other areas where it was easy enough to safely wire up a modern system, it was just not meant to be. So we'll need to wait for a proper intervention from the electricians. But don't go thinking I'll be shortchanging you guys, because here we have the chandelier in question. And although we were unable to fix this absolute beauty in place, we could, for the very first time, revel in the fact that we had brought some light and life to this palace for the first time in a generation. Join me next time as we do our very first deep dive into the veranda, discovering its past and immersing ourselves in the world that once was.